Welcome. Tonight's story is told in a calm voice to help you unwind and rest. Let's begin. Part 1. Hello. My name is Vivian Langford. I'm 65 years old, and I've learned that there are dinners you never forget, not because of what was served, but because of what was said. Mine happened on a Friday evening, in a chandelier-lit restaurant my late husband and I used to frequent when we wanted to feel elegant, like the world hadn't aged us out of being noticed. I hadn't expected to be invited by my son and his wife, and to be honest, I was surprised when the embossed card came in the mail with my name neatly printed. Dinner at La Camille, 7 p.m. It was signed simply, C. and J. Charles's. My only son, Julia, is his wife. And while I've always tried to stay respectful, I've never been her favorite subject. Too quiet, too observant, too hard to manipulate. But I came. Of course I came. I wore my navy wrap dress, brushed out my silver hair, and arrived on time. They were already seated along with two of Julia's friends I barely recognized, all giggling into their wine glasses. I was greeted with a tight smile and a limp wave. No hug. No, you look lovely. I sat down at the end of the table, next to the waiter station, which Julia pointed to and said with a smirk, "Best seat in the house, full view of the action." I laughed politely. I always do. For the first half hour, I listened. They talked about brands of shoes, business, trips, a friend's divorce that made Julia reevaluate the way she sets boundaries. Charles was mostly silent, eyes down, when the waiter came to take drink orders. He turned to me last. I smiled and said, "A glass of the house champagne, please." Before the waiter could nod, Julia leaned in, tilted her head and said sweetly, but loud enough for the whole table to hear, "She's just the help, isn't she? Oh wait, you don't work here, do you?" The table erupted in laughter. My fingers froze against the silverware. The waiter blinked, unsure what to do. Charles said nothing, and Julia just sipped her drink like she hadn't tried to erase every ounce of dignity I had left. That moment could have broken me years ago. It would have. But instead, I reached into my clutch and took out a folded piece of paper, laid it gently beside my bread plate. "I'm so sorry," I said softly to the waiter. "There's been a little mix-up with the reservation. This table was supposed to be under my name." He looked at the paper, and his eyes widened. Julia scoffed. "You booked this place." I smiled. "Yes, Julia. For all of you. That's why the bill's already covered. And before dessert arrives, I'd like to make a small toast." I raised my glass, my real glass of champagne, and as everyone stared, I looked right at Julia. "To Penthouses," I said, "and to remembering who helped pay your down payment." Her face dropped. The waiter tried not to blink, and somewhere in the corner of my mind, I heard my late husband chuckle. Julia didn't say a word after my toast. Her lips parted slightly, as if searching for a witty retort, but none came. Her friends glanced between her and me, their amusement dissolving into awkward silence. Charles cleared his throat, finally lifting his gaze from his untouched appetizer. But the look in his eyes wasn't concern, it was something closer to recognition. Maybe even regret. The waiter nodded with a professional smile and quietly stepped away, leaving behind a stunned table and the faint sound of classical piano from the corner of the room. I returned to my seat, folded the paper back into my clutch, and calmly sliced into my salad. For the next few minutes, the only sound was the clinking of cutlery. Then, from across the table, one of Julia's friends tried to reset the mood. "So, Vivian, what made you choose La Camille? It's lovely here." Her voice was light, but her eyes darted nervously. I smiled. My husband and I used to celebrate our anniversaries here. He always said this place made him feel like he'd finally made it. I let the words hang just long enough. I suppose it still does. Julia rolled her eyes, but I caught the twitch in her jaw. She hated that I'd taken the spotlight, that I had a story, a presence, a past that mattered, that I'd become someone in this room she couldn't fully control. She leaned forward finally and said, "Well, it's a new generation now. We do things differently." "Yes," I said quietly. "I've noticed." My gaze shifted to Charles, who had started to fidget with his napkin. I'd spent years watching that same nervous habit when he was a boy, when he lied, or when he knew something was wrong but couldn't name it. I wondered how many times Julia had trained him to ignore those instincts. How many dinners he'd sat through silently, while she sharpened her dominance with smiles and digs. And now, here we were. I took another sip of champagne and tilted my head. "You know," I said gently, "I almost didn't come tonight." That got their attention. I wasn't sure if this was an invitation or a performance. Julia blinked. "Excuse me. You wanted me to come," I continued, "but only to play a part. The quiet older woman at the end of the table, grateful for crumbs and compliments she never gets. But I've played that part before. And tonight, I decided I'd rewrite the script." No one spoke, not even the waiter who had just returned with the entrees. And for the first time in years, I didn't feel small at that table. I felt like I'd finally stood up without raising my voice, without name-calling, without apology. Julia's expression hardened, but the silence she tried to fill had already turned on her. One of her friends shifted uncomfortably in her seat and murmured something about needing the restroom. Another pretended to check her phone. It wasn't that they pitied me, they didn't, but they'd sensed something shift, the way predators sense an unexpected force. I wasn't prey tonight. I was something else. Julia leaned back in her chair, arms crossed, trying to smile like none of this mattered, like I was just being dramatic. One of her favorite words when she wanted to discredit me, but her eyes betrayed her narrowed, calculating, like she was flipping through a script that no longer fit the scene. "I didn't mean anything by it," she said, in that overly sweet tone women like her reserve for condescension. "It was just a little joke." "Of course," I said, folding my napkin calmly. "But you should know something about women. My age, we've had a lifetime of little jokes, and some of us stop laughing." Charles looked up at me then, really looked, and for a moment I saw my son again, the one who used to climb into my lap with scraped knees and whispered fears, not the man who sat beside this cold, polished woman like an accessory. "You didn't tell me you were paying for this," he said quietly. "I didn't think it was important," I replied, "but I suppose it is now." He nodded slowly, his hand finally letting go of the twisted napkin. "Why did you?" The question hung in the air longer than I expected. I considered lying, saying it was for tradition or sentiment, but I was tired of polite fictions. Because I wanted to see how I'd be treated when no one thought I was footing the bill. The waiter returned, asking if we were ready for dessert. Julia barely looked at him. "I think we'll skip," she said quickly, but I smiled and said, "Actually, I'd like the citrus tart and coffee. Black." The waiter gave a curt nod and left again. "You came here to make a point," Julia snapped. "You set this whole thing up to embarrass me." "No, Julia," I said softly. "You did that all on your own." I looked around the table. "I simply gave you the stage." Julia looked like she wanted to fight back, to claw her way back to the center of attention. But all she could do was sit in the silence she'd created. Charles didn't defend her. He didn't defend me either. But he looked tired, like a man slowly realizing how many dinners he'd endured with a forked tongue and a bent spine. I didn't need him to speak. Not anymore. The dessert arrived. A delicate tart with glistening slices of blood orange arranged like a crown. I took a bite, and for a moment, the sweetness overwhelmed the bitterness still hanging in the air. Julia whispered something under her breath to one of her friends, but neither of them laughed this time. Their eyes kept darting toward me, unsure of how I'd become the one in control without raising my voice or making a scene. That's the part they never understand. Women like me, quiet women, older women, we don't need to shout. We've had decades of learning how to command a room just by knowing where to place our silence. As the waiter brought the final bill already zeroed out and neatly folded, he gave it to me. With a respectful nod, I slipped it into my purse, stood slowly, and looked around the table one last time. "Thank you for dinner," I said with a warm smile. "I do hope next time the guest list is chosen with more care." I didn't wait for replies. I walked out without rushing, my heels clicking against the marble like a quiet drumbeat of dignity. Outside, the evening air was cool and gentle, and for the first time in years, I felt no shame, no resentment, no ache for approval. Just the satisfaction of knowing that sometimes the most expensive thing you can serve someone is a moment they'll never be able to rewrite. Thanks for watching part 1. She stayed quiet for years, but one dinner changed everything. In part 2, she reveals the real reason her daughter-in-law fears losing control, and it goes deeper than anyone at that table could imagine. Part 2. The last time I kept quiet was the day my son got married. The first time I saw Julia, she wore white. Not because it was her wedding though that came later, but because she always had a way of dressing like the center of something, even when she wasn't. It was Charles's graduation party. She wasn't invited. She showed up anyway, arm in arm with a friend of a friend, laughing too loud and clinging too tight. She found Charles before I could, whispered something in his ear that made him go stiff, and from that moment on, she was everywhere. At first, I stayed polite. That's what women of my generation were taught, never be the problem. Smile. Let the men make the choices. Trust their instincts. But even then, I knew something was off. The way she watched me when I spoke. The way she picked apart my sentences like she was hunting for weakness. The way Charles changed around her. More careful, less open. When they got engaged, she insisted on a small ceremony just for friends. I wasn't even asked to help plan it. I was offered a chair in the third row behind her college roommate's cousin. At the reception, she gave a toast about how families don't raise us, love does. Everyone clapped. I smiled, but something inside me curled like burnt paper. That was 10 years ago. I stayed quiet for 10 years. Watched her reshape Charles into something quieter, more palatable. Watched her take credit for his job offers, rewrite the stories I raised him on, correct his grammar when he mentioned me in conversation. I became a ghost in their version of his life. Present, but only barely. Until now. After that dinner at Le Camille, I didn't expect to hear from either of them. But 3 days later, I got a call. Unknown number. I answered anyway. "Mom," Charles's voice was soft. "Can we talk?" I said yes. But I knew it wasn't just about me. They were afraid, not of what I'd said but of what I might say next. And they were right to be, because there were things I'd kept buried. Letters, emails, bank statements, and a little box of wedding photos. Julia thought I'd never seen photos of her with a man who wasn't my son, dated 2 weeks before their engagement. Charles didn't ask about the photos. He just said, "Can we meet somewhere quiet?" We chose a cafe tucked behind an old bookstore, the kind of place you only find if you're looking for silence. He was already seated when I arrived, nursing a lukewarm coffee with a look that reminded me of the boy who once broke my favorite vase and tried to glue it back together. Before I noticed, "She doesn't know I'm here," he said. I nodded and sat. No hugs, no pleasantries, just 2 people at a table with too much history between them and too little truth. "Why now?" I asked. He looked down at the table. "Because the way you looked at her that night, I'd never seen it before. It wasn't angry. It wasn't even hurt. It was done." He swallowed hard, and I realized maybe that's what I should have done a long time ago. I said nothing. Let him sit in it. Let him name it for once. "I found some messages," he continued, "on her old laptop, from before we were married. She lied about where she was, who she was with. I could have handed him the photos right then. I didn't. Instead, I waited. She always told me you didn't like her because you were jealous," he said. "Said you thought she was replacing you, that you wanted control." I looked at him carefully. "Did you believe that?" He hesitated. "I think I wanted to." That was the closest I was going to get to an apology. I opened my bag and pulled out the small envelope I'd carried for over a decade. "This came in the mail 1 month after your engagement. No return address. No note. Just this." I slid it toward him. He opened it slowly, his hands shaking. More than I remembered. When he saw the date on the back of the photo, his breath caught. "She said this was a cousin," he whispered. "She told me it was from a family wedding." "Charles," I said gently, "that man isn't her cousin. His name is Daniel. I know because he sent me an email 2 years later, asking me not to tell you." Charles didn't speak for a long time after that. He just stared at the photo like it might rearrange itself into something easier to explain. "He emailed you?" he finally asked. I nodded. Said he didn't want to ruin her future. That he hoped she'd moved on and would make you happy. He thought he was doing the right thing. Charles leaned back in his chair and exhaled like he'd been holding something in for years. "And you just kept this. What good would it have done back then?" I said. "You were already planning the wedding. You wouldn't have believed me. You needed to learn it for yourself." He rubbed his temples like he was trying to erase the last decade. "I feel like such a fool." I reached across the table and touched his wrist lightly. "Being in love isn't foolish, but refusing to see what love turns into, that's where people get lost." He didn't pull away. That, in itself, felt like progress. "She's been seeing someone again," he muttered. "I don't have proof. Not yet. But I know. I feel it. The distance. The fake smiles. The late nights she says are self-care events." He laughed bitterly. I didn't even know what that meant until last week. I watched him carefully. "And if you find proof?" "I don't know," he said. "I don't even know who I am without her anymore." That broke my heart more than anything else. Not the betrayal, not the lies, but how small he'd allowed himself to become under her shadow. I could see it all so clearly now. How she chipped away at him piece by piece, until all that was left was someone too unsure to even recognize his own pain. I wanted to scream, to drag him out of that hole by force. But I knew that wouldn't work. You can't save someone from a story they haven't finished reading. So instead I said, Then maybe it's time you decide how the next chapter goes. Because the last one was written without your pen. Charles nodded slowly, but I could tell his mind was already turning over 1,000 thoughts at once, memories, suspicions, conversations he'd repressed now unraveling like loose threads. He looked older than he had at dinner, even though only days had passed. The kind of aging that doesn't show up in mirrors, only in posture. Do you still have the email? He asked. I did. Printed. Backed up. Time-stamped. But I didn't hand it to him yet. Not because I didn't trust him, but because I needed him to understand something first. Charles, I said gently, this isn't about catching her. It's about remembering who you were before she told you who to be. He looked up, eyes glassy. I was happy at first, I think. Or maybe I was just relieved someone wanted me as much as she pretended to. I held his gaze. You were always enough. But people like Julia, they don't want partners. They want mirrors. And the moment you stop reflecting them, they crack you. He let out a breath he'd been holding far too long. She's planning something, he said suddenly. I can feel it. Not just another affair, something bigger. She's been asking strange questions about the house, our shared accounts. She got friendly with this lawyer at a party last month. Keeps talking about financial independence, like she's on a talk show. My stomach tightened. Do you have a will? I asked. Joint accounts? Life insurance? Yes to all, he said, then paused. Though I updated the beneficiaries a few years ago, she didn't know. I listed you. I didn't know that either. I reached for his hand again, this time holding it longer. Whatever she's planning, you have time, but you need to stop giving her the benefit of the doubt. That woman left you breadcrumbs of affection and called it a feast. He chuckled through his sadness. You always did have a way with words. I had to, I said. When no one's listening, you learn to make every sentence count. When I got home that night, I didn't cry. I didn't pace or scream or break things like I might have 20 years ago. I just sat in my chair by the window, watching the wind move through the trees like it always had, like it always would. The calm after truth is a strange thing. Not peaceful, exactly, but steady. I knew Charles wasn't done yet, not even close. But I also knew that something in him had cracked open. Not broken, just open. And once someone's eyes adjust to the light, they never quite go blind again. The next morning, I received an envelope slipped under my door. No stamp, no name, just thick cream paper and careful penmanship I hadn't seen since the rehearsal dinner, all those years ago. It was from Julia. Inside, a single card. I saw you two at the cafe. Thought you should know. I'm not the enemy, but if you make me one, you won't like how I fight. No signature. Just that. The threat was thinly veiled, but I'd worn thicker lies as perfume. I folded the card and tucked it into my drawer with the others. The old photos, the email printout, the documents I'd been collecting quietly for years. Not to use. Not unless I had to. I never wanted a war. I only ever wanted peace. But peace, I've learned, is not the absence of conflict. It's the presence of power. And for the first time in a long time, I finally remembered where mine was. Thanks for watching part 2. She thought she was just helping her son. But now the game has changed. In part 3, an anonymous letter arrives, and someone's carefully hidden past is about to come back with a vengeance. Part 3. The letter with no return address. The envelope was pale gray, heavier than it looked, with no return address and a postmark from 2 towns over. I wouldn't have opened it if not for the weight of it. Not physical, but emotional. Something about it felt like a door I'd already walked past once and somehow forgotten. Inside was a folded sheet of thick paper and a photo. The photo came first. Grainy, old, black and white, but unmistakable. My son, Charles, at maybe 22, standing in front of the courthouse steps with a woman I didn't recognize. Her hand was in his. Her smile wasn't for the camera. It was for him. The letter was short. You once told me truth doesn't expire. I held mine for as long as I could. Now I'm letting go. Ask Charles who she was. Ask what he promised her. And ask why Julian never wanted this photo to surface. No signature. No clue who sent it. But something about the handwriting, sharp, precise, emotionally restrained, felt deeply familiar. I stared at the photo again. The woman looked older than Charles by a few years. Not Julia. Not anyone I'd seen at their wedding. I flipped it over and found a date scribbled in the corner. April 2001. Just 5 months before he met Julia. My stomach knotted. I had never seen this woman in any stories he'd told. Never heard her name. But the way they stood, that wasn't casual. That was history. I kept the photo close and placed the letter into my desk drawer with the others. Then I sat in the quiet for a long time, wondering how many stories in our family had been built on the silence of women no one bothered to ask about, and why that silence was always so expensive. I didn't call Charles right away. I needed time, not to process what I'd seen, but to steady myself for what he might say when faced with something he thought was buried. I spent the afternoon walking through the rose garden behind my house, pruning stems with more force than necessary, listening to the wind catch in the thorns. By sunset, I'd decided. I invited him over for tea the next morning, just like I used to when he was a boy with scraped knees and too much pride to ask for help. He arrived on time, polite as ever, holding a small bouquet of peonies. A peace offering, maybe, or a shield. We sat in the sunroom, the morning light falling across the old parquet floor, and I poured us both a cup before sliding the photo across the table. His hand froze midway to the sugar bowl. "Where did you get this?" he asked, his voice lower than usual. "It came in the mail," I said evenly. No note, just that. Line number 1. But I needed his raw response. He studied the image for a long time. The way someone might look at a scar they'd forgotten was there. "Her name was Denise," he said finally. "We were engaged. Briefly. It ended badly." He looked up at me then, eyes searching. "She wasn't the woman I was supposed to build a life with. But you loved her," I said. Not a question. He nodded slowly. "Yes, I did. But she wanted things I couldn't give her. Time, certainty, children. I was scared. I pulled away." "And Julia?" I asked. He hesitated. "Julia made sense. She had a plan. She didn't ask me to be more than I was. She just needed you to look the part," I said. He flinched but didn't deny it. I leaned forward, my voice quieter. "Charles, was there ever a child?" His head snapped up. "What? With Denise? Was there ever talk of—" "No." He cut me off quickly. "No. She wanted to start a family, but we never got that far." His eyes darted to the photo again, as if searching for something. Maybe confirmation. Maybe a ghost. "Why now?" he whispered. "Why is she sending this now?" "You think it's her?" I asked. "Who else?" He said. "No one else knew about that photo." I didn't press further. But the way his hand trembled slightly as he reached for his tea told me he wasn't sure. Not really. And maybe, deep down, he feared it wasn't Denise who sent the letter at all, but someone who knew both of them. Someone close. Someone who wanted this to erupt now, after all these years. I waited 3 full days before hearing anything again. And when I did, it wasn't from Charles. It was from a blocked number that called twice and hung up. Then, 5 minutes later, a second envelope appeared in my mailbox. This time thinner. No photo. Just another letter, typed this time with a sentence that stopped the world around me cold. Ask Julia what she said to Denise the night she left town. I read it again and again. The weight of that one sentence pulled everything else into question. I had assumed Charles was the reason Denise disappeared from his life. But now a new player had stepped into the light, and the rules changed. I remembered the wedding rehearsal. Julia had arrived with perfect hair, polished nails, a smile that never quite met her eyes. I remembered a woman watching everything. Watching Denise slip into the room after hours. Watching Charles pull her aside. The whispered conversation near the church vestibule. The tense jawline when Denise left, and Julia's champagne toast. That followed, laced with sugar and subtle warning. Could Julia have known? Could she have intercepted something? A phone call, or letter, or worse, confronted Denise directly. That would explain the sudden breakup, the silence, the missing explanations. But then the question became, why? Why would Julia interfere? Fear, jealousy, or something more strategic? Charles had always been my son, but in many ways Julia had become the architect of his adult life. Every major decision, the move to the city, the change in firms, the way he dressed, spoke, even the friends they kept, bore her signature. I had excused it as love at first, then ambition. But now it looked like control. I sat at my desk that night and opened the drawer with the old documents, pulling out the engagement announcement from a forgotten society page I'd clipped years ago. Denise Langley, graduate of Wellesley. Legal aid turned political strategist. Smart, well-connected, with a reputation for stubborn integrity. Exactly the kind of woman who didn't just disappear quietly. And yet, she had no forwarding address, no wedding, no scandal, just gone. I began making calls, not to Charles. I wasn't ready to confront him again. But to old friends in Boston, to a librarian who still owed me a favor, to a woman I once mentored who now worked in probate records. I didn't know what I was looking for exactly, just confirmation that Denise Langley still existed, that someone remembered her, that I wasn't chasing shadows. Because if this was just the beginning, if the photo was a warning and the second letter a threat, I needed to know whether Julia had buried more than a relationship. I needed to know if she had erased a person. The call came at 7:42 a.m. the next day. I was standing in the kitchen, pouring coffee into my favorite porcelain mug, when the landline rang, a sound so rarely heard these days it nearly startled me. I let it ring twice before answering, half expecting another silent click. But instead, a woman's voice, low, calm, with just enough edge to slice through pleasantries. "You're looking in the wrong places," she said. Julia didn't erase Denise. She became her. I stood frozen. "Who is this?" I asked. But the line had already gone dead. I replayed the words again and again as I stared at the steaming cup in my hand. My thoughts spiraling into impossible shapes. Became her. What did that mean? Was it metaphorical? Some cruel jab implying Julia had stolen Denise's life. Or something deeper, more literal. My mind refused to settle. I took the mug with me to the study, sat down, and stared at the pile of notes I'd scribbled over the past week. One phrase now circled in thick red ink. Ask Julia. I hadn't confronted her yet. I hadn't wanted to. But the time for silence was over. I dressed with care, not for vanity, but for armor. A slate gray wrap dress, simple pearl studs. The antique watch my late husband gave me the year we bought this house. I wanted to remind her who I was. Not just Charles's mother, not a widow sipping tea in the background, but a woman with history, memory, and presence. When I arrived at their house, Julia answered the door herself, wearing yoga pants and an oversized sweatshirt. No makeup, no shield. Everything okay? She asked, brow furrowed with something that looked like concern. Or it's polished imitation. We need to talk, I said, privately. She led me to the kitchen. The house was quiet. Charles had likely left early for work. I sat at the counter while she filled a glass with water. Is this about the photo? She asked before I even said a word. That caught me off guard. I didn't expect her to bring it up first. What do you know about Denise Langley? I asked directly. She blinked, but didn't flinch. She was Charles's ex. I've heard the name. Why? Because someone is sending me messages, photos, letters, questions about her. And you were there the night she vanished. Vanished. Julia set the glass down hard. She broke things off. Charles told me she wanted something else. She moved. What does any of this have to do with me? You tell me, I said. I received a letter saying you spoke to her the night she left. That you said something persuasive. For the first time, she hesitated. Her eyes dropped. Her breath caught. I told her the truth. She said softly that Charles wasn't going to leave the firm, that he wasn't ready to start a family, that his fear of failure would always outweigh his promises. I didn't lie to her. I just confirmed what she already knew. And why would you do that? I asked. Because I loved him, she said without shame. And she didn't understand who he was. She wanted him to be someone else. I accepted him exactly as he was. You manipulated her, I said flatly. You stepped in when she was unsure and sealed her exit. She was going to leave anyway, Julia shot back. I just made sure she didn't take him with her. I stared at her, at the measured way she delivered that confession, and something new settled in my chest. Not shock, not anger, clarity. Julia hadn't changed. She had always believed she was the rightful architect of Charles's future. And now, with this storm building, she was scrambling to protect what she'd built. Someone's trying to unravel you, I said. And if it's not Denise, then it's someone who knew her. Someone who's been watching. Julia's expression flickered. Not with fear, but calculation. Then let them come, she said quietly. I have nothing to hide. But as I stood to leave, I saw the faint tremble in her hand as she picked up her water. I saw the reflection of doubt ripple across her polished surface. And I knew, whatever she thought she had buried, it was no longer resting in peace. Thanks for watching part 3. The truth is rising, one whispered secret at a time. In part 4, someone unexpected knocks on her door, and what they bring might finally shatter everything she thought was buried. Part 4. The knock that changed everything. It was a quiet morning, the kind that comes after too many restless nights. The sky overcast, the air still, as if the world itself was holding its breath. I had just finished placing fresh flowers in the foyer vase, a habit I'd clung to for decades. A reminder that beauty could still be arranged even when everything else felt out of place. When the doorbell rang, it wasn't a courier or a neighbor or anyone I recognized from the distorted glass panel. It was a woman, early 40s, dark trench coat, eyes sharp like she had seen too much and chosen to remember it all. "Mrs. Harper?" she asked. I nodded, uncertain. "My name is Natalie Wells. I was Denise Langley's roommate." The night she disappeared, the world tilted just slightly, not with drama, but with the dizzying shift of something finally stepping out of shadow. "Come in," I said, voice steady even as my fingers clenched around the edge of the door. I led her into the sitting room, offered tea, which she declined. She held a manila envelope in her hands like it was made of glass. "I've been watching," she said, sitting across from me. Not in the creepy way, I swear. Just waiting. Because I always knew someone would start looking again. I just didn't expect it to be you. I asked her what happened that night. She took a long breath. Denise had packed a bag. She was calm. Not sad, not scared, just sure. She said she was going to tell Charles it was over for real. She even left a note for me. Said she might go stay with her aunt in Vermont, but then she never called, never arrived. And 2 days later, I found this. She handed me the envelope. Inside, a photograph. Old, faded. Denise standing next to Julia. Not Charles. Just the two of them, outside the same gallery I'd seen in the earlier photo. But this one was different. Denise wasn't smiling. She looked cornered, trapped. And Julia's hand, not on her shoulder, but gripping her wrist. "I found this hidden in Denise's sketchbook," Natalie said. She never mentioned being close with Julia. In fact, she avoided her like the plague. But I remembered something Denise said the week before. Something that made no sense. Until I saw this. "What did she say?" I asked. "She's not afraid of losing Charles," Natalie recited. "She's afraid of what I know." My spine tingled. What did Denise know? Natalie shook her head. "She never told me. But she said if anything happened to her, it would be because someone wanted to keep Charles clean, untouched." Silence stretched between us like a fault line. I felt everything shift. My understanding of Julia, of Charles, of the last 20 years. Natalie stood, ready to leave. "There's more. I'll send it. But I needed to see your face first, to know if you were one of them, or one of us." After she left, I sat in that same chair for nearly an hour, photograph in hand. Julia had lied, or at least, she had chosen which truths to bury. But what haunted me more was the thought that my son, my Charles, might not have been an innocent bystander after all. That maybe Denise hadn't just been removed to make space for Julia, but to protect him. And now, the past was demanding its audience. I stood, placed the photo beside the one that had started it all. To moments, to women, one lie, stretching decades. And finally, I wasn't the only one who saw it. I didn't sleep that night. I couldn't. I sat on the edge of my bed, turning that photograph over in my hands until the corners curled and the light from the window shifted from moon to dawn. It wasn't just what Natalie had said. It was what it implied. That Julia had always known more than she let on. That Charles might have been involved in something darker, more deliberate. And worst of all, that Denise had tried to escape and never made it. By mid-morning, I was already in the car, envelope in my bag, destination clear. Julia's estate. I hadn't been there in years. Not since the last Christmas gathering she hosted before selling her Hamptons home and retreating into a glass high-rise overlooking the city. But I remembered the gate code. She'd always said, "Your family." That code never changes. I pulled up to the iron gate, heart pounding, and when it slid open, it felt like the past beckoning me in. She greeted me in silk, always polished, unbothered. "Margaret," she said, surprised but composed. "This is unexpected." "Not half as unexpected as what I found," I replied, brushing past her into the marble foyer. She didn't try to stop me. Not really. Just followed with a quiet, careful step. I laid the photo down on her glass table, then waited. She stared at it for a long time. Not shocked, not confused, just quiet. "Where did you get this?" she finally asked. I told her every word. About Natalie, about the sketchbook, about the conversation Denise had before she vanished, about the possibility that Charles, my Charles, had something to do with it. And the whole time, Julia said nothing. No denial, no outrage, just silence that stretched too long. "He was young," she finally whispered, voice barely audible. "He didn't understand what she would do to him if it got out." My stomach turned. If what got out? Julia looked at me then, really looked at me. She knew about the fund. She said, about the deals his father made to hide the offshore accounts. She threatened to expose it. Not to ruin Charles, to ruin his father. But that would have destroyed everything. Your husband's reputation, the firm, the family legacy. So Charles panicked, and I helped him clean it up. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't move. She said it so plainly, as if it was just a choice. Clean it up. I echoed. You mean cover up a disappearance? Julia nodded, slowly. It wasn't supposed to be forever. We just wanted her to disappear. Long enough for the news to move on. But she never came back. And Charles, he changed. After that, he was never the same. I felt something crack inside me. Something old and buried and fragile. My son. My boy. He'd been so distant for years. I thought it was the pressure. The weight of our name. But what if it was guilt? What if it was grief? Not for what he lost, but for what he did. Why now? I asked, voice shaking. Julia stepped closer. Because you're the only one still asking. Everyone else has moved on, forgotten, or chosen to forget. And then she said the words that froze me. You're the last person alive who might still care about the truth. But be careful, Margaret. The truth doesn't free everyone. Sometimes it finishes them. Julia didn't cry when I finished. She didn't scream or deny it. She just stood there, shaking, not from fear, but from something else. Rage, maybe. Or humiliation. You think this makes you a hero? She whispered, voice brittle like glass about to break. You don't understand what she did to him. What she would have done to all of us. But the more she spoke, the more hollow it sounded. She had spent so long twisting the truth, curating it like an art piece on a gallery wall. She didn't know where the frame ended and the lies began. I watched her take a shaky breath, straighten her shoulders, and walk out of my house without looking back. She didn't ask what I planned to do with everything I knew. She didn't ask who else I'd told. I suppose she already knew. That afternoon, I sent the envelope, copies of the letters, photos. Timelines. To Charles's office by courier. I didn't include a note. I didn't need to. And by evening, the fallout had begun. Charles called once. I didn't answer. He texted later that night. I need time. Thank you for telling me. I had no idea. I read it once, then deleted it. Some bridges are better left in ashes. The headlines didn't come until a week later. Julia's name wasn't in them, not directly, but the quiet resignations, the shuttered nonprofit she chaired, the sponsor list that disappeared from the gala invitation. They said enough. And me. I returned to my garden, watered my orchids, took my walks through the park with my head high. Not because I'd won anything, not because revenge had made me younger, richer, or famous, but because I had finally stopped letting anyone else write the final chapter of my story. That family dinner where I was called to help. That night became the last time anyone underestimated the woman at the end of the table. Because I'm not the help. I'm not a footnote. I am the legacy they pretended to protect. And I made sure they never forgot it. This story is an original work written entirely by me. Every line, every turn of emotion was crafted with care to reflect something deeply human. The feeling of being overlooked, dismissed, and underestimated. In this case, our heroine wasn't seeking riches or glory. She wasn't trying to ruin lives. She simply refused to be silenced. Across for parts, I wanted to explore what happens when a woman, once brushed aside like a shadow in her own family, finds her voice and uses it not to shout, but to stand firm. From that cruel insult at the dinner table, she's just the help, to the final moment of quiet resolve. This story shows how dignity, truth, and patience can become the sharpest form of power. It wasn't about revenge in the loud, cinematic sense. It was about reclaiming space, rewriting the story others tried to write for her, and walking away without flinching. Thank you for watching, for feeling it with me, and for recognizing the value in stories like this. If it made you think of your own strength, or your silence, then it did what it was meant to do.